She wasn't carrying a weapon. She wasn't running. She was standing in the Arizona sun wearing a floral blouse and holding a paper program with her son's name printed on the cover. And somehow, that still wasn't enough. Captain Dale Mercer had his hand on her arm before she could take another step. His voice cut across the crowd like a blade, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again. This area is restricted. You need to leave, now." The woman didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice, just looked at him with those steady gray eyes, and said quietly enough that only he could hear, "I'm here for my son's graduation." Mercer didn't care. He'd already decided what she was. And the moment he grabbed her arm to pull her back, the sleeve of her blouse shifted and something appeared beneath it. A tattoo. Faded by time, but unmistakable to the one man in that crowd who knew exactly what it meant. Gunnery Sergeant Walt Pryor went completely still. The color left his face like someone had pulled a drain. His eyes locked on that mark and didn't move, because he knew that symbol. He knew the story attached to it. And if he was right about who this woman was, then Captain Dale Mercer had just made the worst mistake of his career. If this story already has you on edge, stay with me until the end, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about this woman. Hit like, subscribe, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning had started the way most graduation days at Iron Ridge Marine Depot started. Too hot, too crowded, and running 15 minutes behind schedule. Iron Ridge sat in the high desert northeast of Tucson, Arizona. 300 acres of red rock and pavement baking under a July sun that showed no mercy to anyone in uniform or out of it. The base had been holding Marine graduation ceremonies for over 60 years, and the routine was tight. Families funneled through the main gate, cleared security, and were directed to the parade grounds, where folding chairs had been arranged in long rows facing a raised platform draped in red, white, and blue bunting. Rachel Carter arrived at 8:47 in the morning. She was 44 years old, medium height, with sun-lined skin and dark blonde hair she'd pulled back because of the heat. She wore a loose floral blouse, khaki slacks, and comfortable shoes. She was carrying the program, a small handbag, and a photograph. A school portrait of a young man in his late teens grinning like someone who just realized something important about himself. Her son, Private First Class Jonah Carter, was graduating from recruit training in 43 minutes. She'd driven from Flagstaff the night before, slept badly in a highway motel, and gotten turned around twice finding the family entrance because the signage near the main gate had been partially blocked by a delivery truck. By the time she reached the checkpoint, she was warm, a little late, and carrying more anxiety than she usually let show. The security specialist at the main gate, a young lance corporal barely old enough to shave, had checked her ID, confirmed her name on the family access list, and waved her through with a polite nod. Standard procedure. No complications. She followed the painted arrows on the tarmac, moving with the slow river of other families. Grandparents with folding fans, siblings on phones, a pair of toddlers in matching outfits eating granola bars and ignoring the heat the way only small children could. The parade grounds were straight ahead, past the motor pool, past the administrative building, and then through a narrow corridor between two long barracks structures. That was where she took the wrong turn. It wasn't dramatic. There was no fence, no signage, no clear barrier between the family corridor and the secondary access path that ran alongside the equipment yard. The painted arrow on the tarmac had peeled and faded into near invisibility, and Rachel, distracted by the photograph she'd taken out to look at one more time, stepped left instead of right and ended up 30 feet down a path that was technically, according to base protocol, off limits to civilian family members. She realized her mistake almost immediately. Stopped, looked around, and was already turning back when she heard boots on pavement behind her. "Ma'am." The voice had authority built into it, not earned authority, but the kind that came from rank alone. Rachel turned and found Captain Dale Mercer walking toward her with the particular stride of a man who had identified a problem and was now going to solve it publicly. Mercer was 31 years old and had been stationed at Iron Ridge for 8 months. He had good posture, a crisp uniform, and the specific brand of confidence that came from never having had someone push back hard enough to dent it. He wasn't cruel by nature, but he was the kind of officer who treated every procedural deviation as a potential threat, and who had, over the course of his career, developed a habit of performing his authority for whatever audience happened to be nearby. There were plenty of them today. Families were moving along the corridor 20 feet away, close enough to hear everything clearly. "Ma'am, this area is restricted. You need to turn around and proceed back to the main corridor." Rachel kept her voice even. "I know. I'm sorry. I took the wrong turn. I'm heading back now. I need to see identification." She'd already shown her ID at the gate. She said so politely. "You're in a restricted area. I need to see it again." She put the photograph back in her bag, unzipped the front pocket, and handed over her driver's license. Mercer looked at it longer than necessary. "Rachel Ann Carter, Flagstaff, Arizona." He looked up. "What are you doing in this area?" "I made a wrong turn, Captain. I was looking for the parade grounds." "The parade grounds are clearly marked. The arrow on the tarmac has mostly worn off." That wasn't the right thing to say. Mercer's jaw tightened slightly. "The signage on this installation is adequate. What unit is your dependent assigned to?" "Dependent?" Rachel noted the word but didn't react to it. "Delta Company. My son is Jonah Carter, private first class." "And what was your reason for entering the restricted path?" She kept her tone level. "I made a wrong turn. You said that. It's still the answer." A few of the families in the main corridor had slowed down. A woman with 2 small children had stopped entirely, watching with the cautious attention of someone who wasn't sure whether this was routine or something worse. An older man in a veteran's cap caught Rachel's eye briefly, then looked away. Mercer handed back her ID. "I'm going to need you to wait here while I confirm your access clearance." Rachel looked at him steadily. "My son graduates in 35 minutes. "That's not my problem, ma'am." Something crossed her face then. Not anger, not quite. Something flatter and older than anger. She put her ID back in her bag and stood where she was. She had learned a long time ago that certain fights were won by waiting. Mercer stepped back and keyed his radio, speaking quietly. Behind him, Gunnery Sergeant Walt Pryor was making his way through the corridor toward the checkpoint. Pryor was 52, broad through the shoulders, with short gray hair and the deliberate gait of a man who had learned to move through crowds without disturbing them. He'd been assigned to family coordination for the graduation, a role he performed every quarter with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else. He wasn't heading toward Rachel specifically. He was responding to the radio contact Mercer had made, because that was his job. He came around the corner of the barracks and saw the situation. Female civilian, early 40s, standing calmly while a captain made a show of checking her clearance, and he started to do the quiet math of how to smooth this over with minimal disruption. Then he saw the tattoo. Rachel's sleeve had ridden up slightly when she'd reached into her bag for her ID. The blouse was short-sleeved to begin with, and the movement had shifted the fabric up another inch, just enough to expose the inside of her left forearm. The tattoo was old. The lines had softened with age and sun, the way military tattoos did when they'd been there long enough to become part of someone's skin, rather than something placed on top of it. But the design was specific in a way that time couldn't entirely blur. A stylized caduceus, the medical staff with the 2 serpents, but modified, smaller, set within a particular geometric border that was non-standard, unofficial, and unique to exactly one unit that had operated in the Al-Anbar province of Iraq between 2004 and 2006. Walt Pryor's feet stopped moving. He had that tattoo memorized because he had almost had it himself. He'd served with a Marine Special Operations unit attached to a forward operating base outside Ramadi during the worst year of that war. He knew the corpsmen who'd designed that particular marking. He knew what it meant to have earned it. He knew the stories, some of them firsthand, some of them handed down through the informal network of men who'd been there and carried those years in their bodies the way other people carried photographs. He knew one specific story better than the others. A November night, 2005, a 3-story building in a contested neighborhood caught in a crossfire that had gone wrong almost from the first minute. 4 Marines down on the 2nd floor. The corpsman, a woman, which was unusual enough to stick in the memory, who had climbed those stairs twice under fire, treated wounds that should have been fatal, and stayed until every man who could be moved had been moved, despite being hit herself, despite explicit orders to pull back, despite everything. He knew her name because it had been spoken in a particular tone, quiet, deliberate, almost reverent, by men who did not speak that way about very much. Rachel Carter. Pryor stood completely still for the span of maybe 4 seconds. His face had gone the color of old cement. Then Mercer did the thing that made it irreversible. "Ma'am." His voice had shifted, taken on a harder edge. He'd gotten off his radio and apparently not gotten the answer he wanted, which had made him impatient. "I'm going to need you to come with me to the security office while we sort this out. I've shown you my ID. I'm on the family access list. I made a wrong turn on your fated pathway." "Ma'am, I'm not debating this with you." "I'm not debating either. I'm stating facts." Mercer stepped closer. "I need you to come with me. If you refuse, I'll have to treat this as a security incident." "On graduation day," Rachel said, not as a question. "Ma'am, in front of all these families, I'm giving you one more opportunity to comply before—" He reached for her arm. It happened fast, not violently, but firmly, the way authority gets physical when it decides words have run out. His hand closed around her elbow to turn her, and Rachel's sleeve pulled back another 2 inches, and the full tattoo was suddenly visible to everyone in the immediate area. Walt Pryor's voice came out immediately, low but clear. "Captain?" Mercer turned his head. "Sir." Pryor was already moving, and there was something in his movement that was different now, something deliberate in a way that had nothing to do with routine coordination. "Sir, I need you to stop what you're doing." Mercer blinked. "Gunnery Sergeant, I'm handling a security situation." "No, sir." Pryor was standing beside them now, and he wasn't looking at Mercer. He was looking at Rachel's arm. "With respect, sir, you're not." Mercer stared at him. In 8 months at Iron Ridge, he had never once heard Walt Pryor interrupt him at a scene. Rachel lowered her arm. She hadn't said anything during the exchange between them. She was watching Pryor with the kind of recognition that existed below words, a flicker of something in those gray eyes, like the surface of still water disturbed by a single stone. Pryor met her gaze. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice, steady Walt Pryor, 29 years in the Corps, seen everything and reacted to almost nothing, came out slightly rough. "I'm sorry for this." She studied him for a moment. "Do I know you, Gunny?" "No, ma'am, but I know of you." He paused, and what passed over his face was not professional courtesy. It was something older and more specific. "I served with Sergeant Okafor, Ramadi, 2005. Something shifted in Rachel Carter's face. Not a smile. Not quite. More like a door opening on a room she kept carefully closed. "He made it through," she said. It wasn't a question either. She already knew. "Yes, ma'am. He retired 3 years ago. Lives in San Diego." Pryor's jaw was tight in a way that had nothing to do with the situation Mercer thought was happening. "He talks about you." Mercer had been watching this exchange with the mounting irritation of a man who has lost control of a scene and cannot understand why. "Gunnery Sergeant, what is—" "Captain." Pryor turned to look at him directly. His voice was still even, but it had texture in it now, the particular weight of a man choosing his words very carefully to avoid saying something he couldn't take back. "I need you to step back from this individual, sir. Right now. She's a civilian in a restricted Captain, please." The please was what did it. Not a request exactly, but the kind of word a man uses when he is protecting someone from themselves. Mercer let go of Rachel's arm and stepped back half a step, his face tightening with confused offense. Pryor was already reaching for his phone, not the radio, his personal phone. That was a detail that several of the family members standing in the corridor would later remember. The gunnery sergeant didn't go through channels. He didn't call his CO, didn't relay through dispatch, didn't follow any of the standard protocols for an access dispute on graduation day. He called the base commander directly. Colonel Sandra Voss was standing near the staging area on the far side of the parade grounds when her phone went off. She answered on the second ring, listened without interrupting. Her expression didn't change much. Sandra Voss had spent 26 years making sure her expression didn't change much, but her aide noticed her go still in a particular way. "Don't let her leave," Voss said. "I'm on my way." She clicked off and turned to the group around her, the sergeant major, two battalion commanders, a logistics officer who had been explaining something about tent configuration. She looked at them each in turn. "With me," she said. "All of you." Back on the restricted path, Dale Mercer had retreated to a position of tense, uncertain authority. He didn't know what Pryor had said into that phone, and Pryor wasn't telling him. Rachel Carter was standing in the same spot she'd been standing in for the last 12 minutes, looking not at Mercer but at the mountains visible above the barracks roofline, brown and red and worn down by centuries of heat. She had the expression of someone waiting for a bus, or waiting for a storm. The expression of someone who had learned that the fastest way through certain experiences was to simply stand still inside them. Mercer tried again. "Ma'am, I still need you to accompany me to the—" "No," Rachel said. Just the one word. No heat in it. No defiance even. Just a flat refusal, delivered with the calm of someone who was entirely certain about exactly two things: where she was going to stand, and that she wasn't moving. Mercer stared at her. "Excuse me? I'm not going anywhere with you, Captain. I am a commissioned officer on an active military installation, and I'm a civilian here for my son's graduation who took a wrong turn on a path with a faded arrow." She turned her eyes from the mountains and looked at him directly. Not with hostility, with something quieter and more corrosive. "If you're going to detain me, you'd better be very sure about what you're doing." Mercer stepped closer. He was a full 3 inches taller than her, and he knew it. "Is that a threat?" "It's advice." She held his gaze. "Take it however you want." Several families in the corridor had fully stopped moving now. A man was filming on his phone. Two of the older veterans in the crowd were watching with that specific stillness that came from experience. Not nosiness, but recognition. They could see something in the woman's posture that Mercer couldn't read. He raised his voice slightly. Let the audience work for him. "Ma'am, I am giving you a direct order to—" "She's a civilian," someone in the crowd said. An older man in a VFW cap. Just those 3 words, and then silence. Mercer rounded on him. "Sir, I need you to stay out of—" "Captain." Everyone turned. Walt Pryor was standing perfectly still, phone at his side, looking not at Mercer but at the path that ran alongside the barracks toward the main corridor intersection. His expression had gone somewhere else entirely. Not anxiety, but the sharp, particular alertness of a man who has been waiting for something and just seen it arrive. The sound of footsteps came first, quick, purposeful, multiple sets of them. Then, around the corner of the barracks, a black command vehicle had already parked at the intersection, and coming on foot were the people who had gotten out of it. Colonel Sandra Voss, Iron Ridge's base commander, walking fast, her face tight, trailing her sergeant major, 2 battalion commanders, and an aide who was struggling slightly to keep up. The crowd felt it immediately, that particular shift in atmosphere that happens when the highest authority in a place suddenly becomes visible. Conversations dropped off, phones lowered, bodies moved without meaning to, opening a path. Voss walked straight to the restricted path, straight through the stopped crowd, and straight to the small group at its center. She was 50 years old, with close-cropped gray hair and the economic movements of a person who had stopped wasting motion sometime in her 30s. She took in the scene in approximately 2 seconds. Mercer, Rachel, Pryor, the watching crowd, the faded arrow on the tarmac, the folded program in Rachel Carter's hand. And then she stopped in front of Rachel. She looked at the tattoo. Something moved through her face, quick, controlled, but unmistakably real. She stood straight, shoulders back, heels together, and she saluted. Not a nod, not a small gesture, a full, formal military salute, rendered with the precision of someone who had practiced it 10,000 times and knew every gram of what it weighed when given to the right person. The crowd had gone completely silent. Dale Mercer was standing 4 feet away. The color had left his face entirely. Rachel Carter looked at the colonel for a long moment. Then she did something no one there had expected. She returned the salute, automatically, instinctively, the way a reflex works, the body remembering what the mind tries to keep quiet. Her right hand came up clean and certain, and for the span of that moment you could see exactly who she was underneath the floral blouse and the worn-down shoes and the paper program with her son's name on the cover. Voss lowered her hand. Her voice was steady, but it had that roughness that certain emotions leave in the throat when they're being held back carefully. "Mrs. Carter," she said, "I'm sorry. This should never have happened." Somewhere in the crowd, a child asked its parent in a loud whisper what was going on. Nobody answered, because standing at the center of all of it, in the July heat, with the mountains behind her and hundreds of strangers watching, was a woman who had spent almost 20 years being exactly what she appeared to be: ordinary, quiet, unremarkable, easily overlooked. And the most senior military commander on the installation was standing at attention in front of her. Dale Mercer's mouth opened, closed. His hand, the one that had been on Rachel Carter's arm 12 minutes ago, hung at his side like something disconnected from his body. He looked at Pryor. Pryor looked back at him with the expression of a man who had tried to warn him. Rachel Carter lowered her arm. She looked at the colonel. She looked at the crowd. Briefly, without performance. She looked at the program in her hand, at her son's name printed there in plain black type. "My son graduates in 20 minutes, she said. "Yes, ma'am," Voss said. "I know. I'd like to be there for it." "You will be." Voss turned and said something quiet to her aide, who nodded and stepped away immediately, already on the radio. Then she turned back and looked directly at Dale Mercer. The captain was standing with the particular stillness of a man realizing, in real time, in public, with a crowd watching, that the ground he'd been standing on was not what he thought it was. "Captain Mercer," Voss said. Her voice had changed. It was still even, still controlled. But something had come into it, something precise and cold. "Ma'am," Mercer said. His voice came out thinner than he intended. "You and I are going to have a very thorough conversation this afternoon." He swallowed. "Yes, ma'am. Right now, you're going to step back. You're going to let Mrs. Carter proceed to the ceremony with a proper escort. And you're going to think very carefully about every decision you made in the last 15 minutes. Mercer said nothing. Voss turned back to Rachel. "Mrs. Carter, if you'll come with me." Rachel glanced at Mercer once. Just once. Briefly, without satisfaction or anger or any particular emotion at all. Just a look. The kind a person gives something they've already finished dealing with. Then she fell in beside the colonel. The crowd parted for them. Pryor moved into position slightly behind and to the right, the way men with his training moved when they were doing something they felt personally about. And Captain Dale Mercer stood on the restricted path with the crowd still watching, and the morning sun still burning, and the full understanding of what had just happened settling into him like something structural giving way, slowly at first, then all at once. Somewhere on the parade grounds, a drum cadence started up. The graduation was beginning. And walking toward it, chin level, program in her hand, was the woman Dale Mercer had spent the last 20 minutes trying to remove from the base, walking now beside its commander, under the Arizona sky, toward the seat where she'd watch her son take his place in the same corps that had never stopped knowing her name. The drum cadence carried across the parade grounds in steady, rolling beats, and Rachel walked toward it the way she'd walked toward a lot of things in her life, without hurry, without visible emotion, with the particular economy of movement that came from having learned a long time ago that most displays of feeling were expensive and rarely changed anything. Colonel Voss matched her pace exactly. She didn't fill the silence with reassurances or explanations or the kind of institutional apology that was really just self-protection dressed up in courtesy. She simply walked beside her, and after the first 100 yards, Rachel found herself grateful for that. In the specific way she was grateful for things that cost someone something. They were halfway to the parade grounds when Voss spoke. "You didn't have to handle that the way you did." Rachel glanced at her sideways. "How did I handle it?" "Quietly." Rachel looked ahead. "What was the other option?" Voss was quiet for a moment. "Most people would have invoked their record, the decoration, made him understand what he was dealing with. And then what?" It wasn't a question, and Voss understood that. She didn't answer it. The ceremony seating came into view around the edge of the motor pool, rows of folding chairs filling fast, families sorting themselves with the particular controlled chaos of people who'd been given vague directions and were improvising around them. A Navy band was warming up on the far left, the brass section cycling through something that kept stopping at the same measure. Two Marines in dress blues were adjusting a banner that had partially come loose in the morning wind. Rachel's escort, a young corporal Voss's aide had dispatched while they were still walking, appeared at the edge of the staging area and led them to a section near the front. Not the front row, 4 seats in from the aisle, which suited Rachel. She'd spent enough of her adult life having people look at her. She sat down and put the program on her lap and folded her hands over it. Pryor had separated from them at the entrance to the grounds. He was back to his coordination duties now, moving through the crowd with his clipboard. But before he peeled off, he'd stopped beside Rachel and said something he clearly hadn't planned to say, the words coming out a little blunt and unpolished the way honest things did. "For what it's worth, ma'am, what Okafor said about you, he meant it." She looked at him. He was already looking away, already moving, the way people did when they'd been more candid than they intended. She didn't call after him, but she held on to that sentence for a moment, pressed against it, the way you pressed a bruise not out of self-punishment, but just to feel the specific shape of it, and then she set it down and turned her attention to the parade grounds. The ceremony itself took 47 minutes, which was about right for a July morning in Arizona. The color guard came first, moving with that particular slow precision that looked effortless and was not. Then the battalion commander spoke, a lieutenant colonel who made exactly 3 jokes and had the good sense to keep the rest of it under 6 minutes. Then the drill instructors were introduced, and the crowd applauded in that way civilians did when they were genuinely moved but slightly unsure of the protocol. Then the recruits came out. There were 84 of them in Delta Company, marching in 4 columns across the parade grounds with the kind of precision that had not existed 3 months ago and would fade slightly over the years into something looser and more human, but was, right now, on this particular morning, genuinely impressive. They were young. That was the thing Rachel was unprepared for, even though she knew it, had known it abstractly for months, because abstract knowing and visual reality were different things. They were so young. Their faces were controlled and unreadable in the way they'd been trained to make them, but she'd spent enough years reading faces in conditions that didn't allow for ambiguity, and underneath the discipline she could see every one of them, nervous, proud, exhausted, trying not to look for their families in the crowd. She found Jonah in the 3rd column, 2nd row. He was taller than she remembered, which was impossible since she'd seen him 8 weeks ago, but there it was. He had her coloring, the dark blonde, the gray-green eyes she couldn't see from this distance but knew were there, and his father's jaw, which was something she'd made her peace with a long time ago. She didn't wave, didn't call out his name the way some of the parents around her did, leaning forward, hands cupped to their mouths. She just watched him, and she watched him the way she'd watched a lot of things, completely, carefully, with the specific attention of someone who understood that some moments could not be recovered if you let them slip past. He was looking for her. She could tell by the slight movement of his eyes along the family section, quick, controlled, not breaking his bearing but searching. She raised one hand, just slightly, not high enough to draw attention from the people behind her. His gaze stopped, settled, and he looked straight forward again, but something changed in the line of his shoulders. That was enough. That was more than enough. What Rachel didn't see because she was watching her son was Dale Mercer. He hadn't gone to the security office. He probably should have. Voss had effectively dismissed him from the scene, and the implication of "we'll talk this afternoon" had been clear enough. But the specific kind of man Mercer was did not, when left alone with a humiliation, go sit quietly and wait for the consequences. He went looking for context. He went looking for information. He went looking for the thing that would reorganize the morning's events into a story where he'd been operating on incomplete information rather than being simply and publicly wrong. He'd gone to the administrative office first, pulled what he could on the name Rachel Carter, civilian, no current military affiliation, Flagstaff address, son enrolled in Delta Company. Nothing there. No flags, no commendations, no service record accessible through his clearance level, which was the first thing that stuck in his thinking like a splinter. His clearance level. Most veterans who'd done anything notable had service records you could at least partially access. The absence of accessible information wasn't a blank. It was a wall. He'd called a contact in personnel, someone he occasionally used for informal lookups, nothing officially sanctioned, and gave the name and the approximate service window. Early 2000s, Navy, medical, possibly attached to a Marine Special Operations unit. The contact had gone quiet. "Run that again for me," the contact said. Mercer repeated it. Another pause, longer this time. That tattoo, you said you saw a tattoo. What did it look like? Mercer described it. The caduceus, the geometric border, the placement. Dale! The contact's voice had shifted in a way that made Mercer's shoulders tighten. Where is she right now? At the graduation ceremony. Okay. A breath. Listen to me. I'm saying do not take any further action regarding this individual. Do you understand me? I need to understand No, you need to understand that you've already done enough. Another pause. Possibly more than enough. I'll make some calls. Just stay away from the ceremony. The contact disconnected. Mercer stood in the administrative office with his phone in his hand and the particular sick clarity of a man who had been trying to climb out of a hole and had just realized he'd been digging it deeper. He stayed away from the ceremony. But staying away did not stop the machinery that was already in motion. The graduation ended with the traditional eagle, globe, and anchor ceremony, where each new Marine received the emblem from their drill instructor's hand, a formal exchange, brief and quiet amid the overall noise, that had been stripping otherwise composed young men and women down to something unguarded for as long as the tradition had existed. When Jonah Carter's row moved forward, Rachel rose from her seat slightly without deciding to. Around her, parents were doing the same, and she let herself be part of that. Let herself be, for once, just a mother watching her son. Afterward, families were released to a designated meeting area along the eastern edge of the grounds, where recruits were permitted 45 minutes with visiting family before the afternoon schedule resumed. Rachel moved through the crowd at her usual measured pace and found a spot near the edge where the crowd thinned out, partly because she preferred the margin of things, and partly because standing in the middle of a large crowd of strangers still did something to her nervous system that she managed but did not enjoy. Jonah found her in 4 minutes. He was wearing his dress uniform, which she hadn't seen in person before, and for a moment they both just looked at each other across the 10 feet of grass between them. Not awkwardly exactly, but in the particular careful way of two people who loved each other and had spent years being imperfect at expressing it. Then he crossed the distance and hugged her, and she let herself do that completely, both arms, and didn't police the duration of it. You made it, he said. I said I would. He pulled back and looked at her. He'd always been observant, too observant sometimes, for a kid she'd tried to keep sheltered from certain things. Are you okay? One of the other families said something happened near the equipment yard. Some kind of incident with a civilian. I took a wrong turn. Jonah studied her face the way he'd been studying it since he was 7 years old, looking for the thing she wasn't saying. Mom. I'm fine, Jonah. Was it you? She looked at him evenly. He read the look. He exhaled. What happened? An officer was doing his job very thoroughly. She paused, and then his commanding officer arrived. Jonah stared at her. What does that mean? It means it got sorted out. She touched his arm briefly, the equivalent from her of a much longer reassurance. Tell me about training. Tell me the actual version, not the one from your letters. He let it go, but not all the way. She could see it sitting in him, that question, stored, set aside, not forgotten. He was 19ly good at that, better than she'd been at his age. They talked for 31 minutes. He told her about the 3rd week, which had almost broken him, and about the DI who'd been brutal in a way that turned out to be exactly calibrated, and about the private from Georgia in his bunk row who'd become the kind of friend that 3 months of shared misery made. She listened the way she'd always listened, completely, without interrupting, without redirecting toward lessons or larger meanings, which was something she'd learned to do deliberately because it did not come naturally. She did not tell him about Ramadi. She had not told him about Ramadi in 19 years, and this morning's events had not changed that calculation. What she did not know, while they were talking, was that 20 yards away, on the other side of the crowd, a conversation was happening that would change it. Walt Pryor had found Sergeant Major Dennis Farr near the staging platform. Farr was 61, lean and weathered, with 3 decades of service and the specific quality of attention that came from having been, for most of his career, the person who stood slightly behind the highest-ranking officer in the room and watched everything. He and Pryor had overlapping histories, separate units, parallel timelines, The informal network of men who'd served long enough to know each other's names without having shared a foxhole. "You made the call," Farr said. Not a question. "Yes, Sergeant Major." "Good." Farr looked toward the crowd. "She know what Voss has in mind for this afternoon?" Pryor shook his head. "I don't think she knows about any of it yet." Farr was quiet for a moment. "The captain's going to push back. You understand that. He's going to say he was working with incomplete information, which is technically true." "It's not the point, Sergeant Major." "No," Farr agreed. "It's not." He turned to look at Pryor directly. "You served near that unit, in Anbar." "Adjacent, different sector." Pryor paused. "I heard the stories. Everybody who was anywhere near that AO in 2005 heard the stories." "Then you know what she got awarded." "Yes, Sergeant Major." Farr nodded slowly. "The captain doesn't know. That's going to be the defense. He didn't know, and maybe that's even true." He looked toward the crowd again. "The problem is, the way you treat somebody without knowing who they are tells you more about a person than the way you treat them when you do know." Pryor said nothing. He didn't need to. "She'd try to invoke it?" Farr asked. "Not once." Something moved through the sergeant major's face. "Of course she didn't." He picked up his clipboard. "Get me everything you have on the Ramadi file. The unit records, the commendations. Whatever's in the accessible portion of the archive." He paused. "The colonel's going to want it for this afternoon." "Yes, Sergeant Major." Farr started walking. "And Pryor." "Sergeant Major." "What she did, staying out of it the way she did, not invoking anything, that's not patience." He didn't stop walking, and his voice was even, practical. "That's a specific kind of strength. Make sure the people in that office this afternoon understand the difference." The 45-minute family period ended at 11:30. Families began filtering back toward the exit, while the new Marines reassembled for afternoon processing. Rachel walked with Jonah to the edge of the formation area where the protocol required them to part ways. He was about to step away when he stopped. "Mom." She looked at him. "That officer this morning." His voice was measured. He was 19, but he'd been raised by a woman who valued precision in language, and it had transferred. "He put his hands on you, didn't he?" It wasn't quite a question. Rachel considered him. She could deflect it. She'd deflected harder things from him for most of his life. But he was in uniform now, and they were on this particular ground, and there was something in his eyes that told her the deflection would cost more than it was worth. "It was handled," she said, "by the colonel." "Yes." His jaw tightened in exactly the way his father's used to, which she noticed and set aside. "I want to know what happened, the real version." "You will," she said. "Tonight. I'll tell you what I can." He held her gaze for a moment, testing whether she meant it, and seemed to decide she did. He nodded. He turned toward his formation. "Jonah." He looked back. "You looked good out there." He almost smiled. "You're biased." "Obviously." She kept her face level. "Still true." He turned away, and she watched him go. And she kept watching until he'd folded back into the formation and was no longer distinguishable from the other young men in identical uniforms, which was, she understood, partly the point. She was turning to find the exit when Voss's aide appeared at her elbow. "Mrs. Carter." He was young, mid-20s, with the barely suppressed nerves of someone who'd been given an instruction he was slightly afraid to deliver. "The colonel would like to see you before you leave the installation. At her office, if that's okay, ma'am." Rachel studied him for a moment. "Is it optional?" The aide blinked, opened his mouth, closed it. "I'm asking sincerely," she said, not unkindly. He straightened slightly. "The colonel said to tell you that you're not obligated. She said to make sure I said that." Rachel thought about the drive back to Flagstaff. The motel checkout she'd already missed by 2 hours, which would cost her an extra night's rate she'd deal with. The particular kind of tired that the morning had produced, which was different from physical tired and harder to address. She thought about Jonah and what she'd said to him. "You will. Tonight." "All right," she said. "Lead the way." Voss's office was in the administration building, second floor, at the end of a hallway lined with photographs. Installation commanders going back 40 years, Formal portraits in dress uniform, the kind of documented lineage that military institutions maintained as both history and assertion. Rachel didn't look at them on the way in. The office was large but not lavish. A desk with good sightlines to the door, the kind of positioning that was habit, not decoration. Two windows facing south, currently bright with midday sun that Voss had apparently decided not to block with the blinds. A conference table along the left wall with 6 chairs, 3 of which were occupied when Rachel entered. Sergeant Major Farr was there, standing near the window. A woman Rachel didn't recognize, late 40s in civilian clothes with the bearing of someone who was not quite military and not quite not, was seated at the table with a legal pad in front of her. A JAG officer in uniform was at the far end of the table, also seated, also with documents. Rachel slowed just slightly when she saw the arrangement. Not visibly, she'd spent years keeping things invisible, but internally. This was not what she'd expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected, but not this. Voss came in from a side door 30 seconds after Rachel sat down. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which caught Rachel slightly off guard. She set one in front of Rachel without asking how she took it, which meant she'd been told or had guessed, and sat down across from her. "Thank you for coming," Voss said. "I didn't think I had a choice. I wanted you to have one. I meant that." Rachel looked at the legal pad. The JAG officer, the woman in civilian clothes who still hadn't been introduced. "What is this?" Voss set down her coffee cup. "2 things, separately. First, Captain Mercer. I want you to know what's already been put in motion. He's been relieved of his current duties pending a formal review. That review will look at his conduct this morning and at his broader pattern of authority exercise over the last 8 months. I initiated it before I left the parade grounds." Rachel was quiet. "I want you to know that because I want it on record, not just in my office but with you directly, that what he did was not acceptable and will not be treated as acceptable." Voss paused. "The incomplete information argument is going to come up. His counsel will use it. I want to be honest with you about that." "I know. You're not surprised. I've been in enough rooms where that argument gets made to know how it goes." Rachel looked at her steadily. "What's the second thing?" Voss glanced at Farr briefly. Something passed between them. The compressed communication of people who'd worked together long enough to hold entire conversations in a single look. Then Voss turned back. "The second thing is why Sergeant Major Farr pulled the files from the ONBAR archive this morning, and why I asked Captain Reyes," a small nod toward the woman in civilian clothes, who turned out to be, Rachel now understood, not a civilian at all, "to be here." Rachel looked at Reyes. Reyes looked back at her with the direct, evaluating attention of someone in an official capacity who was trying to get the measure of her in the same way Rachel was trying to get the measure of the situation. "Mrs. Carter," Reyes said. Her voice was even, with the particular flatness of someone who'd spent years in rooms like this one. "When was the last time anyone formally acknowledged your service record?" Rachel considered the question and what was underneath it. "First Force Service Support Group sent a letter," she said, "after I got out. Standard separation acknowledgement. That's the last contact. That's the last contact." Reyes wrote something on the legal pad. "And the decoration, the Navy Cross. Have you ever—" "I received it," Rachel said, "at the time. But there's been no public recognition, no formal ceremony, no— I didn't want one." The room went quiet. "Mrs. Carter," Reyes said after a moment, "the reason that matters today is that what happened this morning, a decorated combat veteran being publicly detained and humiliated on a military installation, is the kind of event that tends to surface things. There are family members who filmed the interaction. As of about 40 minutes ago, at least one of those videos was being shared in a veterans community group." She let that settle. "It's going to move faster than any of us can contain it." Rachel looked at the table. Something was moving through her, slow and heavy. Not panic, not anger. Something more complicated and older. "And the story that's going to attach to that video," Reyes continued, "is going to be incomplete. Because the people sharing it don't know who you are. They just know what they saw." She paused. "We think you should be the one who decides how much they know." The room was very still. Outside, through the south-facing windows, the parade grounds were visible in the far distance, empty now, folding chairs being stacked by two Marines in work uniforms, the bunting still flapping in the morning wind. Rachel stared at the window for a moment. "My son doesn't know about Ramadi," she said. Her voice was level, but it cost something. Nobody in the room filled the silence that followed. "He knows I served. He knows I was a corpsman. He's never asked for more than that, and I've never volunteered it." She turned back to face the table. "He's 19 years old, and he just graduated from the same corps. If his mother becomes a story, he'll hear about it either way," Voss said quietly. Rachel looked at her. "I'm not telling you what to choose," Voss said. "But if the video moves the way Reyes thinks it will, and it surfaces without context, the story that gets told won't be accurate, and it won't be kind." She folded her hands on the desk. "At least if it comes from you, it's yours." The JAG officer at the end of the table hadn't spoken yet. He was young, early 30s, with the slightly overwhelmed look of someone who'd been brought into a room where the actual weight of the situation significantly exceeded the procedural function they'd been assigned. He was there, Rachel understood, because of the formal review of Mercer. His presence was about paperwork. But Reyes was not paperwork. Reyes was something else, something Rachel had identified without being told, and was now turning over carefully, examining the shape of it. "Who do you work for?" Rachel asked. Reyes met her eyes. "I work for the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. I was already on base today for a separate matter. When the colonel called me in—" "That's not what I asked." A beat. Reyes set down her pen. "I work for the NCIS. I also have a personal reason to be here." She paused, and something in her expression shifted. Not much, but enough. "My brother was 2nd Lieutenant Marcus Reyes, Kilo Company, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, Ramadi, November 2005. The sound of the bunting flags carried through the glass faintly. Rachel went very still. "He told me your name," Reyes said. "He told me in 2006, when he came home. He's told me every year since." She looked at Rachel without flinching. "He told me you climbed those stairs twice, that you told him to stop apologizing for bleeding, that when the building started coming down you were still working on Corporal Vega's femoral, and you refused to move until it was done." Rachel's hands were flat on the table. She was looking at Reyes directly. "He said," Reyes continued, and her voice stayed even, but only barely, "that he thought about you every time something hard happened, that he used you like a reference point." She stopped. "He's a high school principal in Albuquerque now. He has 3 kids. He coaches their soccer teams." She let that sit. "Because of what you did on that staircase." The room was completely silent. Rachel's jaw moved. She swallowed once and looked away from Reyes, toward the window, toward the empty parade grounds, toward whatever was out there that was easier to look at than this. Outside, a gust of desert wind moved through the installation, hot and dry, rattling the bunting that was still attached to the platform railing. The 2 Marines stacking chairs paused, leaned into it slightly, then went back to work. "Mrs. Carter," Voss said, after a long moment. Her voice was careful. "Whatever you decide about the public story, that's yours to decide, and I mean that. But I want you to know that this afternoon there's going to be a formal review proceeding regarding Captain Mercer, and the question of your record is going to come up in that proceeding whether or not you choose to speak." She paused. "You have the right to be present. You have the right to speak. And you have the right to say nothing, and we will proceed without you." Rachel looked back from the window. She looked at the empty legal pad in front of her. The JAG officer had a copy of a form waiting, something she'd need to sign to be formally involved in the proceeding. She hadn't touched it yet. She looked at Reyes, who was watching her with the particular expression of someone who has said the thing they came to say, and is now prepared to accept whatever comes from it. She looked at Voss. "What time?" Rachel asked. "Is the proceeding?" 1400, Voss said. Rachel looked at the clock on the wall. It was 12:47. She pulled the legal pad toward her. She picked up the pen. She didn't sign it yet. She just held the pen and looked at the form, at the lines of official language, at the blank where her name would go, and through the window she could see, at the far end of the parade grounds, one of the new Marines crossing the tarmac in the afternoon heat, moving with that particular deliberate bearing of someone who had just become a version of themselves they hadn't been before. She couldn't tell from this distance if it was Jonah. She signed her name. Reyes reached into the folder in front of her and removed a single sheet of paper. She set it on the table and pushed it gently toward Rachel without saying anything. Rachel looked down at it. It was a photograph. Black and white. Photocopied from an original. The grain and contrast of old battlefield documentation. A rubble-filled stairwell, partially collapsed. A woman crouched on the second step from the top, working over someone lying on the landing. The woman's face was turned toward the camera at the moment the photograph was taken, not posed, not aware, just caught mid-motion, and the expression on her face was not fear, not bravery, not any of the things people put in that category. It was concentration, pure, absolute, expensive concentration, the kind that costs everything you have and gives nothing back to aesthetics or performance. Rachel looked at the photograph for a long time. She had never seen it before. She hadn't known it existed. "Where did this come from?" she said. Her voice was different now, not loud, not broken, just different in the way that voices got when something reached through the armor that time had built and found the thing underneath. "My brother had it," Reyes said quietly. "He's carried it for 20 years. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened. Footsteps. The ordinary sound of the building going about its afternoon. Voices, brief and professional, fading as they passed. Rachel set the photograph face up on the table and looked at it once more. Then she looked up at Sandra Voss. "Tell me," she said, "exactly what Captain Mercer said to his contact in personnel this morning." Voss went still. "Because the call he made, I'm guessing that's why you have a JAG officer in the room and not just an administrative review." Rachel set the pen down with precise quietness. "He wasn't just checking my access clearance. He was trying to find something he could use." She looked at Voss levelly. "And I want to know what he found." The colonel and the sergeant major exchanged the kind of look that confirmed something Rachel had suspected from the moment she walked into the room. This was not just a review of a captain's conduct at a graduation ceremony. This was something larger. And whatever Dale Mercer had been digging for in the personnel archives, whatever he'd pulled, whatever he'd found or thought he'd found, was sitting somewhere in a folder that nobody in this room had opened yet. Voss reached into her desk drawer. She put a second folder on the table. She didn't open it. She just left it there between them, in the afternoon light, and looked at Rachel with the steady, careful expression of someone about to say something that was going to change the shape of the day completely. The folder sat on the table between them like something with weight beyond its paper. Voss didn't open it immediately. She did the thing that good commanders did before delivering information that would change the architecture of a conversation. She gave the other person a moment to brace without announcing that bracing was necessary. Rachel looked at the folder, then at Voss. "Before I open this," Voss said, "I want to be clear about something. What's in here doesn't change the review. Mercer's conduct this morning stands on its own, and the proceeding at 1400 is about that conduct regardless of anything else." She paused. "But you need to see this because it changes what the proceeding is going to look like." "Open it," Rachel said. Voss opened it. The top document was a printed log of a personnel query, time-stamped 10:14 that morning, approximately 40 minutes after the incident on the restricted path. The query was submitted under Captain Dale Mercer's access credentials, and it was not a standard clearance check. It was a cross-reference search, pulling from 3 separate databases: Active Service Records, Navy Corpsman Historical Archives, and Rachel's eyes moved to the third entry and stayed there. A restricted database designated for decorated combat personnel whose records had been partially sealed at their own request upon separation. That third database required a higher clearance than Mercer held. He had accessed it anyway. Rachel looked up from the document. "He got in." "He used a borrowed credential," Voss said. "We don't know yet whose. That's part of what JAG is here for." She nodded toward the young officer at the end of the table, who had stopped pretending to be invisible and was now sitting straight in his chair with the focused expression of someone who had realized, about 15 minutes ago, that this case was significantly larger than a graduation day access dispute. Rachel looked back at the document. "What did he pull?" Voss turned the page. It was a partial record printout. Her record, or the accessible portion of it, which was less than a third of the full file. Name, service dates, unit affiliations, and at the bottom of the second page, flagged with an asterisk, a single-line notation that read, Commendation, see attached classified annex. Access restricted per request of subject, DD Form 2890-C, filed. March 14, 2007. The classified annex was not attached. Mercer hadn't been able to pull it. Whatever he'd been looking for, whatever he thought he could find to justify the morning, it was behind a wall he couldn't get through. But the fact that he'd tried was its own document now. He was building a file, Rachel said. That's what it looks like. On me, this morning, while I was sitting at his graduation ceremony. Yes. She looked at the printout for a long moment. Something was moving through her, not the hot kind of anger which she'd learned long ago was expensive and imprecise, but something cooler and more structural. The kind of response that organized itself into clear sequence. What happened, what it meant, what needed to happen next. He didn't find anything, she said. No. But he was going to keep looking. Based on the query pattern, Reyes said from the other side of the table. Yes. This wasn't a one-time check. He ran the same name 3 times in 40 minutes, escalating the database level each time. The third access is the one that triggered the flag in our system. She paused. Which is how I got the call. Rachel set the document down. She looked at Reyes. You were already on base for something else. A separate matter, unrelated. But when you got the flag, I came to the colonel's office instead. Reyes met her eyes, because I recognized the name. The room was quiet for a moment, in the specific way that rooms got quiet when something had been said that everyone understood and nobody needed to annotate. Rachel pulled the unsigned portion of the JAG form toward her. She looked at it, the formal language, the procedural structure, the blank lines waiting for her statement. She understood what signing it fully meant. Not just witness testimony and a conduct review, a formal record. Her name, her history, the morning's events, all of it entering the institutional machinery in a way that would not be reversible. She'd spent 17 years keeping that machinery at arm's length. She picked up the pen. She signed where the JAG officer indicated. He took the form with slightly unsteady hands and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Carter," in the careful voice of someone who understood they were in the presence of something they didn't have full context for. "What time?" Rachel said. "Do the new Marines get their family dinner?" Voss checked her watch. 1800. It was 13:02. She had just under 5 hours. "Then let's not waste the afternoon," Rachel said. The review convened at 14:03, 3 minutes late, in the main conference room of the administration building, larger than Voss's office, with an oblong table and 10 chairs and a window facing north that let in flat, even light without the afternoon glare. A court reporter was present. The JAG officer, whose name was Lieutenant Keating, Rachel had learned during the intervening hour, sat to Voss's right with his documents organized into 3 separate stacks. Captain Dale Mercer arrived with a legal representative from the base legal office. The representative was a captain named Hollis, mid-30s, competent-looking, with the practiced neutral expression of someone whose job required never looking surprised. Mercer walked in behind her and sat down without looking at Rachel, which told her everything she needed to know about where his head was. He looked like he hadn't slept since the ceremony, despite the fact that only 4 hours had passed. There was a specific quality of exhaustion that came not from physical effort, but from the prolonged effort of managing a narrative that kept expanding in ways you couldn't control. Mercer had that quality. His uniform was still crisp because he was the kind of man who would maintain the uniform regardless, but his face was doing something different from the face he'd been wearing on the restricted path. Sergeant Major Farr was present as a witness. Reyes was present in her NCIS capacity. 2 additional officers, both lieutenant colonels, both from different commands, were present as reviewing authority. Voss opened the proceeding with procedural language that Rachel half listened to and half used as a calibration period, reading the room, reading Mercer, reading Hollis's body language as the charges were formally laid out. Conduct unbecoming, unauthorized database access, failure to exercise appropriate command judgment, inappropriate use of physical contact with a civilian. Each count read in flat, institutional language that made the morning sound like a series of box-ticking violations rather than what it actually was, which was something Rachel had no illusion the formal proceeding was designed to capture. Hollis made her opening position statement with efficiency. Incomplete information, good faith security concern, reasonable officer response to an ambiguous situation. She didn't lean on it hard. She wasn't a fool, and she could see the room. But she laid the foundation with precision. Voss turned to Rachel. Mrs. Carter, you've chosen to provide a formal statement in addition to the written account Lieutenant Keating took this morning. Is that correct? Yes, Colonel. You understand you're not required to answer questions beyond your statement. I understand. Then please proceed when you're ready. Rachel had not written anything down. She'd spent the intervening hour with a cup of coffee in Reyes's folder and her own memory, which was the kind of memory that did not forgive imprecision, that had been trained over years to hold detail accurately because in the context where she'd used it, inaccuracy had consequences measured in blood. She spoke for 11 minutes. She gave the morning's events in sequence: the wrong turn, the initial exchange, the repeated ID check, the escalation, the physical contact. She gave it without editorializing, without emotional inflection, in the flat, ordered language of someone describing a medical procedure: cause, action, response, result. She described what Mercer had said, and approximately when he'd said it. She described the crowd, the families watching, the specific words he'd used when he threatened to make the detention public in front of her son. When she finished, the room was quiet. Hollis cleared her throat. Mrs. Carter, is it fair to say that Captain Mercer was operating without knowledge of your service history at the time of the incident? Yes. And that his initial concern, a civilian on a restricted path, was, in isolation, a legitimate security concern for an officer on duty? Checking my ID was legitimate. The initial redirect was legitimate. Rachel paused. Everything after I showed my ID and stated why I was there was not. He had no way to verify your story immediately. He had a family access list and a radio. Rachel kept her voice even. Verification would have taken 4 minutes. 4 minutes during which you were technically in a restricted area. Standing still, waiting, not moving toward anything. She looked at Hollis directly. If the security concern was genuine, the appropriate response was to confirm my access clearance and redirect me to the family corridor, not to escalate to a public detainment proceeding while my son's graduation was starting. Hollis shifted. The captain was doing his job. Parts of it. A small silence. Mrs. Carter, Hollis said, and her voice had shifted slightly, taken on a more careful register. Are you aware that Captain Mercer has requested the opportunity to address you directly as part of this proceeding? Rachel looked at Voss. Voss gave nothing either way. I'm aware of it now, Rachel said, and I'll hear it. Son, Mercer spoke for 4 minutes. He sat slightly forward in his chair, hands flat on the table, and he looked at Rachel while he spoke, which she gave him credit for. It would have been easier not to. He acknowledged the escalation. He acknowledged that the physical contact, his hand on her arm, was inappropriate and outside protocol. He acknowledged that his subsequent personnel query was an overreach, undertaken, he said, because he'd been trying to understand what had happened and had made decisions he now recognized as wrong. He did not say he was sorry until the very end, and when he said it, it landed with the specific weight of words that have been deliberated over, not entirely spontaneous, but not entirely hollow either. Somewhere in the middle, which was about as honest as formal apologies tended to get. Rachel listened to all of it without expression. When he finished, she said, I accept it. The sentence landed in the room with a quiet that surprised almost everyone. Hollis blinked. Mercer stared. I want to say something, Rachel continued, and I want it in the record. Voss nodded. Captain Mercer made a mistake this morning. He made it in front of hundreds of people, and he made it worse in private when he thought nobody was watching. Both of those things are documented now, and what happens to his career as a result of that is not my decision. She looked at him steadily, but I want the record to reflect that what he did this morning, treating someone as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be spoken to, is not a mistake unique to him. It's a pattern. It happens on military installations, in hospitals, in offices, in parking lots, in 100 different places every day, to veterans who aren't wearing their record on their sleeve, to people who don't have a gunnery sergeant nearby who happens to know their story. She paused. I'm not standing here because of what I did 19 years ago. I'm standing here because I was at a graduation ceremony and a captain put his hands on me without cause. She let that sit. Those are two separate facts, and I wanted on record that the second fact should have been enough on its own. Mercer's jaw was tight, but he was listening. Voss was writing something on the notepad in front of her. Reyes was looking at the table with the expression of someone holding something carefully. That's my statement, Rachel said. Yes. The formal portion of the proceeding concluded at 15:44. The reviewing officers would deliver their findings within 72 hours. Mercer's duties remained suspended pending that determination. The unauthorized database access had been referred to a separate investigative track that Reyes would coordinate with JAG, targeting whoever had provided the elevated credential, a thread that had already, based on what Reyes had said quietly to Lieutenant Keating during a recess, produced a name. Rachel was gathering her bag from the conference room when Farr appeared at the door. Mrs. Carter, a moment. She waited. He came in and closed the door partially, not all the way someone closed a door when the conversation was private but not secret. There's something you should know before you leave the building, he said. She looked at him. The video, the one Reyes mentioned this morning. Farr's voice was matter-of-fact, but there was something deliberate in his pacing, a man laying out facts carefully because the facts mattered and the sequence in which they arrived mattered. It's been posted publicly, not just the veterans group, a public platform shared out twice. As of about 30 minutes ago, it had been viewed approximately 4,000 times. Rachel set her bag down. The title on it, Farr continued, is Marine Veteran Harassed at Son's Graduation. Whoever uploaded it doesn't know the details. They just know what they saw. He paused. Comments are running the way you'd expect. People are angry. Some of them are calling for various things. Who posted it? We don't know yet. Could be anyone who was in that corridor. He looked at her evenly. The colonel is prepared to make a formal statement on behalf of the installation. Standard institutional response. But it will address the conduct without addressing who you are, because that's your information to share or not share. Rachel was quiet. The problem, Farr said, is that somebody else might share it for you. There are veterans in that comment section who are starting to ask questions about the tattoo. One of them, a former Navy man looks like, has already posted that he recognizes the unit marking. Farr paused. He hasn't said your name yet, but he knows the unit, and the unit narrows it down significantly. Rachel looked at the closed portion of the door. Through the gap, she could see the hallway, empty, institutional, fluorescent lit. How long, she said, before someone says my name? Hours. Maybe less. She was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that was not stillness, but movement, everything happening internally, running the calculations, reading the terrain. My son, she said. Yes, Farr said. That's the other thing I wanted to tell you. Something in his tone. She turned to look at him fully. Private First Class Carter was approached approximately 20 minutes ago by a fellow recruit who had seen the video on a family member's phone. Farr's voice was careful. He's been informed there's a video of an incident involving a civilian woman at this morning's ceremony. He doesn't know yet that it's you. Another pause. He's been asking his DI for permission to contact you. Rachel closed her eyes for a half second. It was the only visible thing she allowed. When she opened them, she said, Where is he? Barracks B. His D? I knows the situation. He's been told to hold Jonah there until you can get to him. She picked up her bag. She was already moving toward the door when Farr added quietly behind her, Mrs. Carter. She stopped. What you said in there? About the second fact being enough on its own. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the conference table, at the documents still spread across it, at the institutional machinery of accountability that had spent the afternoon grinding forward. You're right. It should have been. He paused. I wanted you to know that someone in that room has been doing this job for 30 years and understood exactly what you meant. Rachel stood with her hand on the doorframe. "Thank you, Sergeant Major," she said. She went to find her son. Turbinman. Barracks B was a 7-minute walk from the administration building, across the tarmac and past the motor pool, through the narrow stretch of covered walkway that ran along the north side of the maintenance yard. Rachel covered it in 6. Not running, she didn't run toward things, hadn't since she'd learned that arriving composed was usually more useful than arriving fast, but with the specific economical speed of someone who had eliminated everything from their stride that wasn't necessary. The DI who met her at the barracks entrance was a staff sergeant named Quan. Compact, precise, with the kind of face that had probably been young once and had since been reshaped by years of institutional purpose into something more functional than expressive. He recognized her before she introduced herself, which meant either FAR had called ahead or the video had traveled farther in the last 30 minutes than the sergeant major had indicated. "He's in the day room," Quan said. "He's holding it together." "But..." Quan looked at her with the expression of someone who knew that "but" was accurate and was deciding how honest to be. He saw a still image from the video. Someone screenshotted the moment the captain had his hand on your arm. He paused. He recognized your blouse. The specific fine-grained detail of that, your blouse, landed the way specific things did when you were the parent of a perceptive child who noticed everything and remembered what they noticed. "Okay," Rachel said. "Ma'am." Quan stopped himself. "What?" "He's not angry at you. I want you to know that. Whatever he's feeling right now, it's not pointed at you." He said it like a man who had learned in his years of working with young recruits that this was not always obvious to parents and that it mattered to say. Rachel looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant." She went inside. The day room was a long, low-ceilinged space with linoleum floors and fluorescent lights and a row of tables along one wall, the kind of room that was designed for function and contained no excess of anything. 3 recruits were in there, 2 of them playing cards at the far end with the studied casualness of people pretending not to be aware of the situation, and 1 sitting alone at the table nearest the window, forearms on the surface, staring at nothing. Jonah looked up when she came in. He was holding himself carefully. That was the only way to describe it. The controlled posture of someone who had learned, partly through observation and partly through nature, that emotion expressed in a certain direction had costs, and who was currently directing significant internal energy toward keeping the structure stable. He was his mother's son in that specific way. But his eyes, when he looked at her, were not stable. They were doing several things at once. Rachel pulled out this chair across from him and sat down. "I know you saw it," she said. "Part of it." His voice was level, but the effort behind level was audible. "The screenshot." "Okay. Is that..." He stopped, started again. "Mom, was that you?" "Yes." He looked at the table for a moment. His jaw did the thing. "You didn't tell me," he said. "I was going to. Tonight, like I said." "You said you'd tell me what you can." He looked up. "That's not the same thing." She held his gaze. He was right, and she didn't insult him by pretending otherwise. "How bad was it?" he said. "The real version." "He stopped me for a wrong turn and made a 15-minute production out of it in front of a crowd." She kept her voice factual. "He put his hand on my arm when I didn't comply fast enough. Then his commanding officer arrived, and it was handled." "The colonel?" "Yes." "Why did the colonel..." He stopped. Something was working its way through his expression, through the controlled posture and the careful voice, something making its way up from a deeper level. "There's something I don't know. There's something you've never told me." Rachel was quiet. "The tattoo," Jonah said. "Someone on my floor, his uncle was in the Navy. He saw the screenshot and he said that tattoo was from Ramadi, in Iraq, that it was from a specific unit." He looked at her. "You told me you were a corpsman. You told me you did your service and you got out and then you went to nursing school." He paused. "What did you not tell me?" The day room was very still. The 2 recruits at the far table had stopped their performance of playing cards. Outside, through the window, the afternoon sun was beginning its slow decline toward the western range of hills beyond the installation perimeter. Not sunset yet, but moving that direction, the light shifting from white towards something warmer and lower. Rachel looked at her son. 19 years old, in dress uniform, in the corps she had served and left and never entirely left, on the day he had officially joined it. She thought about the photograph Reyes had put on the table, the photocopied image, the staircase, the woman who did not know she was being photographed. She thought about every calculated decision she'd made over 19 years to keep that part of herself separate, to give him a mother who was present and functional and not dragging the weight of a war into his childhood. She thought about whether those decisions had been right or just survivable, and she understood, looking at his face right now, that the question had stopped being abstract. "There's more than I told you," she said. "Yes." "Tell me." "I'm going to." She folded her hands on the table. "But I need you to understand something first. Everything I didn't tell you because I was trying to give you a particular kind of childhood." She paused. "Not an easier one. I'm not sure it was easier, but one that was yours and not mine. Do you understand the difference I'm making?" He stared at her. "Mom." His voice had gone slightly rough. "I joined the Marine Corps." "I know. I joined the same, He stopped himself. "Were you in combat?" Silence. "Jonah." "Were you in combat, Mom? Yes or no?" The fluorescent light above the table flickered once, briefly, a stuttering electrical thing that lasted a quarter second and made everyone in the room acutely aware of it. Rachel opened her mouth to answer. The day room door opened. Quan came in with his face doing something that Rachel recognized immediately, the expression of a person who has just received information that changes the priority of whatever is currently happening and is calculating how to convey that. "Mrs. Carter." His voice was low and specific in a way that put Rachel on a different kind of alert instantly. "I just got a call from the main gate. There's a—" He stopped, looked at Jonah briefly, then back at her. "There are 2 men at the gate asking for you by name. They have federal credentials. They say they're here about the personnel query that was run this morning." Rachel stood up. Quan continued, and his voice had dropped further. "One of them has a document they say authorizes access to the sealed portion of your service record." The room was very still. "They say they were contacted 2 hours ago," Quan said. "Not by NCIS, not by JAAG." He paused. "By the contact in personnel that Captain Mercer called this morning." Rachel looked at Quan. "The contact gave them your name," Quan said. "He told them you were here. He told them about the video." A pause. "And he told them about the classified annex." The sealed portion. The document that Mercer hadn't been able to access. The thing behind the wall he'd been digging toward all morning. Rachel's hand was very still on the back of the chair. "Who are they?" she said. Quan looked at her with the expression of a man delivering information he didn't fully understand, but understood was significant. "One of them is retired military, the other is a contractor. They're traveling together and they have the same federal authorization code, which our gate officer ran twice to confirm." He paused. "The authorization code traces back to a DOD office that deals with veterans' records disclosure, specifically records that were sealed at the subject's request and are being reviewed for..." He stopped. Rachel said it for him because she already knew the word. "Reclassification." Quan looked at her steadily. "Yes, ma'am." Jonah was standing now. He'd stood up while Quan was talking, and he was looking at his mother with an expression that had moved well past the question he'd been about to ask and into something larger and less bounded. The expression of a young man realizing, in real time, that the person he thought he knew most completely in the world contained something he hadn't been shown yet, and that the showing was about to happen whether anyone was ready or not. Rachel turned to look at him, just for a moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then she said to Quan very quietly, "Don't let them on base yet." "Ma'am, I need 20 minutes." Quan held her gaze. He was a staff sergeant with 15 years of institutional obedience built into his operational reflex, and he was being asked by a civilian to delay 2 credentialed federal visitors from accessing a Marine Corps installation, which was technically, procedurally, an instruction he had no formal reason to follow. He looked at her for 4 seconds. "I'll tell them our gate processing for credentialed visitors runs 20 minutes, he said. "It usually runs 8. He turned and walked back out without waiting for a response. Rachel turned to her son. Jonah was standing with his arms at his sides and his chest moving with the slightly elevated breath of someone who has been holding themselves together for 2 hours and is now being asked to hold a different shape. "Sit down," Rachel said. "I'm going to tell you." He sat. She pulled her chair around to his side of the table and sat beside him rather than across from him, which was a decision she made without deliberating about it. The decision of a person who understood that certain conversations needed a different geometry. She put her hands flat on the table in front of her. She looked at the window, at the declining afternoon light, at the installation stretching out beyond the glass, the tarmac, the barracks, the parade grounds in the far distance where the bunting was still up, where this morning had started. She took one breath. "In November of 2005, she said, I was attached to a Marine Special Operations unit in Ramadi, Iraq. We were supporting a company-level operation in a contested urban sector. 3-story buildings, narrow streets, visibility maybe 40 feet in most directions." Her voice was level, practiced sounding, almost the way things sound when they've been carried for years in a very specific internal container. "The operation went wrong in the first 10 minutes. Enemy contact from 3 positions simultaneously. We had 4 Marines down on the 2nd floor of a building before the unit had cleared the ground level." Jonah was very still. "I was the corpsman. I went in." She paused. "I went in twice. The first time I got 2 of them out to the stairwell, and then the stairwell took indirect fire, and I had to move back up. The second time..." She stopped for less than a second. Not from emotion, from the specific effort of describing things that existed in her nervous system as sensation rather than language that had to be translated. "The second time the building was structurally compromised and I was working on a femoral bleed in a man who would have died in 4 minutes if I stopped. And my sergeant major was on the radio telling me to evacuate and I..." Another pause. "I didn't." Jonah made a sound that was not a word. "All 4 Marines survived," Rachel said. "I was hit on the way out. Shrapnel, left shoulder. You've seen the scar. And I told you it was a car accident, which was..." She stopped. "That was wrong. I'm sorry for that." She looked at the window. "The Navy Cross was awarded 6 months later. I requested the record be sealed when I separated. I didn't want it following me." She paused. "I wanted to be a nurse. I wanted to raise you. I wanted to be ordinary." She turned to look at him. "Those were the things I wanted." Jonah was looking at her. His face had undergone several visible changes since she'd started talking and had arrived in the last 30 seconds at something she hadn't seen on his face before or hadn't seen since he was very small, before he'd learned to maintain the careful composure that her own example had partly taught him. His eyes were bright in a way that he wasn't trying to control. "The scar," he said. His voice came out slightly damaged. "You told me. I know what I told you." He looked at the table. His jaw worked. "Were you scared?" he said. Not as a challenge, not as an accusation. The question of a 19-year-old in a new uniform who had spent 3 months being trained for the kind of thing his mother had actually done, asking the only question that felt real. Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "every second." He made that sound again, quiet, involuntary, the kind of sound that people made when something they'd been holding inside finally met the pressure required to release it. Rachel put her hand on his arm. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would be better than the contact, and she'd always understood that about him, even when she'd been imperfect at acting on it. They sat like that for 40 seconds, maybe a minute. The fluorescent light above them was steady now. The window showed the installation in its late afternoon configuration, long shadows on the tarmac, the motor pool winding down, 2 Marines crossing the parade grounds in the distance. Then Rachel's phone buzzed in her bag. She took it out. Unknown number, but the area code was one she recognized from a specific region she had not thought about in 4 years. She looked at it, looked at Jonah. "I need to take this," she said. She stood and moved toward the window and answered it, and what she heard on the other end of the line, 3 sentences, spoken by a voice she had not heard in 7 years, carrying information she had not known was coming and could not have anticipated, made her close her eyes for the second time that afternoon. When she opened them, the late sun was full in her face through the west-facing glass, and she looked older for just a moment, Or not older, exactly, but more completely herself, the way people looked when something stripped away the managed version and left the original. When? She said into the phone. A pause from the other end. Tonight, she said. I understand. She lowered the phone. Jonah was watching her from the table. He had the young man's face back now, controlled, composed, but alert in a way that his training had sharpened and his mother's genetics had always equipped him for. He could see her expression, and he was reading it with the accuracy of someone who had been reading her face for 19 years and knew every variation in its vocabulary. Mom, he said carefully. Rachel turned from the window. Outside, at the main gate a quarter-mile away, two men with federal credentials and an authorization code that traced to a DoD records reclassification office were waiting in a vehicle in the heat, running a clock that now had approximately 16 minutes left on it. And in Rachel Carter's hand, her phone showed a number she would not have expected to see, because the voice on the call, the one that had spoken 3 sentences in 7 years of silence, belonged to someone whose name appeared in her sealed record, whose testimony was part of the classified annex that Mercer's contact had tried to surface, whose existence in connection to her was known only to the people in that document. And that person had just told her that the reclassification wasn't a bureaucratic process, it was being forced. Someone had filed a motion that morning, before the ceremony, before the incident, before any of today had happened, to unseal her record against her request. Filed under a legal mechanism that bypassed her consent. Filed by a name she recognized, not Mercer, someone who had known she would be here today, someone who had known for longer than today. The name on the motion was not Dale Mercer, it was Gerald Soto. Rachel stood at the window with the phone at her side and let herself sit with that for exactly the time it took to breathe in and out once. Then she put the name through the mental file she kept, organized not alphabetically but by context, by event, by the specific weight that certain people carried in her memory, and found it. Gerald Soto, GS-14, Department of Defense, Veterans Records Administration. She had met him twice. Once in 2007, when she filed the sealing request. Once in 2009, when he'd sent a letter questioning the grounds for continued sealing, and she'd responded through an attorney and heard nothing further. She hadn't thought about him in 4 years. He had apparently been thinking about her. Mom. She turned. Jonah was standing, and he had the posture of someone who had processed a significant amount of information in a short window and had arrived at a decision about what to do with his body in the meantime. Stand, be ready, wait for direction. She recognized it. She'd taught it to him without meaning to, the same way she'd taught him to read a room and to keep his voice level when his pulse wasn't. Someone filed a motion this morning to unseal my record, she said. She didn't soften it. He was in uniform, and more than that, he was 19 and had just heard Ramadi and deserved the version without padding. Before the ceremony, before any of today happened, which means it wasn't a response to the incident, it was already in motion. Jonah was quiet for a moment. Who? A man named Soto. He's a federal administrator in the records office. She paused. He has a legal mechanism that allows him to petition for unsealing on grounds of public interest. I've known the mechanism existed. I didn't know he'd use it. Why today? Because the video gave him the public interest argument he needed. She looked at the window. Or he was waiting for a moment like this, and today handed it to him. She turned back to Jonah. I don't know which yet. What she did know, and what the voice on the phone had told her, tersely, in the 3 sentences it had taken, was that the 2 men at the gate were connected to Soto's office. Not NCIS, not JAG, his office. And the authorization code they were carrying had been generated 4 hours ago, which was 2 hours before the formal review proceeding had even convened. Someone had known this morning was going to produce paperwork. Someone had been positioned to move the moment it did. She called Reyes. Reyes picked up on the second ring. I know, Reyes said before Rachel could start. I just got off the phone with my office. The authorization code at your gate, it came through Soto's office and it's legitimate, which is the problem. A pause. The sound of someone moving, a door closing. He has standing to petition. The question is what grounds he's using, and the answer is that he filed under a public accountability provision that was added to the record statute in 2019. Basically, if a decorated veteran becomes a subject of public attention in a context involving their service, and the record bears on that context, there's a provision allowing administrative review of the sealing. The video, Rachel said. The video, the graduation incident, the conduct review, any of it qualifies as public attention. He doesn't need your consent under the provision. He just needs to demonstrate relevance. Reyes's voice was careful, but moving fast. Rachel, if those men get on base and make formal contact with the base commander under that authorization, the unsealing process starts immediately. The record goes into administrative review, and anything in the classified annex becomes accessible. Within the review parameters, yes. Rachel was quiet for 10 seconds, thinking with the kind of speed that wasn't visible from the outside, the internal processing of someone who had learned to run assessments under conditions that didn't permit visible hesitation. Is the provision challengeable? She said. Yes, but it takes time we don't have right now. What do we have? A pause. You have the right to make a voluntary disclosure before the administrative review begins. If you disclose voluntarily through an official channel on record, then the administrative review has nothing to compel. The information is already out, released by you, on your terms. Reyes stopped. But it has to happen before those men make formal contact. Once they log their authorization with the base commander, the clock starts and the window closes. Rachel looked at her watch. Quan had bought her 20 minutes. 8 of them had passed. She looked at Jonah. He was standing in the same position, watching her face with that 19-year-old precision. Okay, she said to Reyes. Get the colonel. Get Farr. Get Lieutenant Keating with a recorder. She paused. I'm coming back to the administration building. How long? 6 minutes. She ended the call. She looked at Jonah and said, Walk with me. And he fell into step beside her without asking anything else, which was either trust or restraint or both. And either way, she was grateful for it. They walked fast across the tarmac in the late afternoon heat, the shadows stretching long from the barracks and the motor pool, the installation moving into its end-of-day rhythms around them, vehicles repositioning, uniformed figures crossing at distance, the mechanical sounds of a facility that never fully went quiet but changed register after 1700. Rachel talked as they walked. She didn't give him everything, there wasn't time, but she gave him the shape of it, the sealed record, the classified annex, the reason she'd sealed it, the things Soto was trying to do, and why voluntary disclosure changed the legal geometry. She gave it in the same flat, sequence language she'd used in the review proceeding, because that was how her brain organized information under pressure, and he was smart enough to follow it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, He's using today against you. He's using today as the mechanism, yes. Even though he didn't cause today. He didn't cause it. He recognized it. She kept walking. There's a difference. Jonah processed that. What happens when you disclose voluntarily? The information becomes mine. What I say, how I say it, what goes into the record? She paused. Instead of what Soto's office decides to excerpt and publish under administrative authority. And the annex goes into the official record as submitted by me, with my framing, my context. Another pause. Instead of being surfaced by a bureaucrat who has a theory about public accountability and no understanding of what actually happened in that building. They were 30 yards from the administration building entrance. Jonah hadn't asked the question she could feel building in him, the one that was not procedural but personal. She preempted it. I know what you're thinking, she said. He glanced at her sideways. You're thinking that if I'd disclosed earlier, none of this morning would have happened the way it did. That the whole Mercer situation could have been avoided. She kept her eyes forward. And you're right. And I made those choices, and I'll own them. But I need you to understand that I didn't keep this from you out of shame. I kept it because I wanted you to know me before you knew my record. And I still think that was right, even if it made this day harder. Jonah walked beside her for 5 paces before he said anything. I do know you, he said. His voice was rough but steady. That's why I'm walking next to you right now instead of back in the barracks waiting to hear what happened. Rachel didn't respond immediately. Then she said, I know. They went inside. The room Voss had assembled in 4 minutes was smaller than the conference room, a working office on the first floor, with a table, 4 chairs, and a digital recorder that Lieutenant Keating had already set up and tested. Reyes was standing by the window. Farr was by the door. Voss was behind the table with the expression of someone who had already made several institutional decisions in the time it took Rachel to cross the tarmac and was prepared to defend all of them. Jonas stood by the wall, not seated, slightly to the side, present, but not at the table. It was his choice. Nobody told him to stay. Nobody told him to leave. Rachel sat down. She looked at the recorder. For the record, she said, my name is Rachel Ann Carter, former hospital corpsman, 2nd class, United States Navy, attached to 3rd Force Reconnaissance Company on special assignment to Marine Forces Special Operations Command, November 2004 through March 2007. She paused. I am making this voluntary disclosure under 10 U.S.C., Section 130E, subsection C, prior to administrative review proceedings initiated by Gerald Soto, GS-14, Veterans Records Administration, dated today. Keating was transcribing and recording simultaneously, which Rachel appreciated. Redundancy was the difference between a record and a rumor. She spoke for 22 minutes. She gave the Ramadi operation in precise, unembellished detail: unit composition, mission parameters, the contact timeline, the building, the 4 Marines. She described her medical actions with the specificity of someone trained to document, which she had been, the wounds, the interventions, the sequence of decisions, the shrapnel injury she'd sustained and when and how it had affected her capacity during extraction. She described the commendation process that followed, reluctantly accepted, she said, because the men she'd treated were alive and commendations for doing your job had always sat awkwardly with her. She described the sealing request. She described why. A nurse in a civilian hospital who treated patients that included veterans, whose effectiveness in that role depended partly on not carrying a military legend into the room with her, because military legends made people behave differently, and she had not wanted people to behave differently with her. She had wanted to do her job. When she finished, the recorder was still running. The room was quiet. Voss looked at Keating. Timestamp and log it. Get it to JAG immediately. Yes, Colonel. And get a copy to NCIS. Voss looked at Reyes. Soto's authorization code is now preempted by voluntary disclosure. He has no grounds to compel review. I'll make the call, Reyes said, already moving. Voss looked at Rachel. The men at the gate. Can go home, Rachel said. Voss allowed herself something that was almost a smile, brief, professional, immediately controlled. I'll handle it personally. She left. Farr stayed one extra moment, looking at Rachel with the expression she'd seen on him twice now. The expression of a man who had been in uniform for 30 years and had calibrated exactly when to show what, and who was showing something now that he did not show often. That took something, he said. A lot of things take something, Rachel said. He nodded. He went. The room contained Rachel, Keating packing up his recorder, and Jonah by the wall. Keating finished, gathered his materials, and left with a quietly spoken ma'am that carried more in it than the word itself. The door closed. Jonah moved from the wall. He sat down in the chair across from her, the one Voss had been in, and put his forearms on the table the way he had in the barracks day room an hour ago. He looked at her. The 4 Marines, he said. Rachel waited. Did you know them? I knew them the way you know people you work with in that context. Not well. Enough. Do you know where they are now? She thought of Marcus Reyes, principal in Albuquerque, 3 kids, soccer practice. She thought of the others. She knew one had retired, one had stayed in, one she'd heard secondhand through Pryor's network had been killed in a later deployment, which was information she carried the way she carried most difficult things. Acknowledged, weighted, set precisely in its container. Some of them, she said. Jonah looked at the table. He was doing the math she'd watched him do since he was 12 years old, assembling a picture from pieces, checking the proportions, revising when the proportions didn't match. The woman in the photograph, he said. That Reyes showed you. Yes. That was you. Yes. He was quiet. Mom. He looked up. His voice was stripped of management now. Not loud, not broken, just direct in the way that people were direct when they'd run out of protective distance. I joined the Corps because I wanted to be part of something that mattered. Because you never told me what you did, but I always knew you carried something, and I wanted to understand what that kind of service was. He stopped. And I'm sitting here realizing the thing I was reaching toward. You already did it. You did it before I was born. Rachel looked at her son. She wanted to say something corrective. It's not a competition. It's not about comparison. Your service is yours. And all of that was true, and none of it was the right response to what he'd actually said. You're going to do things I never did, she said, in circumstances I can't predict, and with people who aren't in my story. That's not consolation. That's fact. She paused. I didn't serve so you wouldn't have to. I served because it was what I could do at the time. And you're here for the same reason. He looked at her for a long moment. Then his phone buzzed, and hers. And from somewhere in the building, they could hear movement, boots in the hallway, multiple people, moving with purpose. She picked up her phone. The message was from a number she didn't recognize, but the content made the number irrelevant. It was a screenshot. A social media post, not the video, not the original share, but a new post, uploaded 18 minutes ago from an account she had never heard of, with a profile picture that showed a man in civilian clothes who was nonetheless identifiable. If you knew what to look for, by his posture and his haircut and the specific way that certain people who had been military could never entirely stop being military. The post was 3 sentences long. The first sentence named Rachel Carter. The second sentence quoted from the classified annex of her service record, specific language, specific detail, information that was not in the accessible portion of her file that was behind the wall Mercer hadn't been able to breach. The third sentence said, "This woman has been hiding behind a sealed record for 17 years. The public has a right to know." The account was registered to Gerald Soto. Rachel looked at the timestamp on the post. 18 minutes ago, 4 minutes before she had made her voluntary disclosure. He had published from the classified annex before the voluntary disclosure window closed, before the legal protection activated, before she had the chance to make it hers. Which meant he had accessed the annex before the authorization code was preempted, which meant he had the annex already, which meant the authorization code, the 2 men at the gate, the 20-minute processing delay Quan had manufactured. All of it had been the visible part. The part designed to be watched, managed, bought time against, while the actual move happened somewhere else. Rachel's phone buzzed again. Reyes this time. The message read, "His office logged the annex access at 09:17 this morning, 3 hours before the authorization code arrived at your gate. He'd had it since this morning, since before the graduation ceremony started. He'd had it, and he'd waited, and he'd published it the moment he calculated that the voluntary disclosure process had been initiated and he had a narrowing window. He'd published illegally, using information obtained through a process he'd initiated before the proper legal authorization was confirmed, disclosing a sealed record without valid preempting authority in a public forum with identifying information. But the post was live, and it had been live for 19 minutes, and Rachel's phone was showing her the number, 4,200 and climbing. She stood up from the chair. Jonah was already standing, reading his own phone, and his face had gone to the place it went when he was furious and managing it. "He leaked it," Jonah said. "Yes." "Illegally." "Yes." She was already moving toward the door, which means this is no longer a conduct review and an administrative petition. She put her hand on the door. "This," she said, "is a federal case." Reyes was already on the phone when Rachel came through the door into the hallway, and from the cadence of her voice, flat, fast, no wasted syllables, Rachel could tell she was talking to someone with authority and that the conversation was past the explaining stage and into the directing stage, which meant Reyes had already done the work of understanding what had happened and was now executing the response. Rachel didn't interrupt. She stood in the hallway and listened to half a conversation and assembled the other half from context, the way she'd spent years assembling complete pictures from partial information. Soto had published from the annex at 1438, The voluntary disclosure had been logged at 14:41. 3 minutes. He'd beaten the window by 3 minutes, which was either very careful calculation or very good luck, and Rachel had stopped believing in that kind of luck approximately 19 years ago. Reyes ended the call. She turned to Rachel. "My office has the post documented and time-stamped," she said. "The annex access log from this morning is already in evidence from the JAG proceeding. The sequence is clear. He accessed a sealed record without valid authorization at 0917, held the information for 6 hours, and published it publicly in what our legal team is already characterizing as a deliberate circumvention of voluntary disclosure rights under federal statute." She paused. "He also tagged 3 journalists in the post." Rachel absorbed that. "Did any of them pick it up?" "One retweeted before we could get a takedown request processed. The post is still live. Platform response takes time, even with a federal flag." Reyes looked at her directly. "Which means the information is out. We cannot put it back." "I know." "Rachel, I know," she said again, and her voice was steady because she'd already moved through the stage where that fact was a crisis and into the stage where it was simply the terrain. He published it illegally, which means the story isn't the record anymore. The story is what he did with the record. Reyes looked at her for a moment. "Yes," she said quietly, "that's exactly right." Jonah was standing behind Rachel, and she could feel him processing the shift in the same way she had, the landscape changing beneath them, the footing uncertain but not impossible. The thing that had looked like an ambush revealing itself as the moment the advantage changed hands. Voss appeared from the stairwell at the end of the corridor, moving fast, with Farr a step behind her. "Soto's been notified that his access was illegal," Voss said, arriving at their position without preamble. "His supervisor at VRA was contacted 6 minutes ago. His supervisor's supervisor was contacted 2 minutes ago." She looked at Reyes. "NCIS has jurisdiction on the unauthorized access, correct? Combined with JAG on the disclosure violation? Yes." Reyes had her folder open. "The federal statute is clear. Disclosing the contents of a sealed record in a public forum without valid unsealing authority is a felony under 18 U.S.C. Section 1030 and a separate violation under the Veterans Records Privacy Act. The 3-minute window he beat is not a defense. The motion to unseal was procedurally invalid from the start because he logged the annex access before the authorization code was even generated." Voss's jaw tightened. "He accessed it before he filed the motion. By almost 8 hours." Reyes turned a page. "He had the annex content before he created the legal mechanism to obtain it. The motion was retroactive cover." Farr, who had been quiet since arriving, said, "So he planned the whole day." Nobody disputed it. Rachel thought about that, about a man in an office somewhere who had known she would be at Iron Ridge today, had accessed her sealed record before sunrise, had generated a legal authorization as after-the-fact scaffolding, and had sent 2 men to the gate as a distraction while he waited for the moment she began the voluntary disclosure process so he could beat her to the record by 3 minutes. It was thorough. It was, in its way, patient. It had taken preparation that stretched back further than this morning, a framework assembled over time, waiting for a day that would give him the public interest argument he needed to make the mechanism plausible. Today had been that day. Not because he'd manufactured the graduation or the restricted path or Dale Mercer. Those had been accidents. But he had positioned himself to use whatever accident came, and today had provided one. "What I want to know," Rachel said, "is how long he's been watching." Reyes didn't answer immediately. She looked at her folder. "The earliest flagging of your name in his office's system," Reyes said, "is 14 months ago." 14 months. Jonah made a quiet sound beside her. "A veterans advocacy piece ran in a DoD internal publication," Reyes continued. "It mentioned sealed records and cited, anonymously, the profile of a female corpsman decorated in Anbar who had requested sealing upon separation. It didn't name you, but the profile was specific enough that someone who knew the unit histories could identify it." She paused. "Soto ran a query the same week the piece ran. He's been building the petition framework since then." Rachel looked at the window at the end of the hallway. Evening light now, the sun fully committed to its descent, the installation going orange and red around its edges. 14 months of patience. For a record she had tried to make private because she'd wanted to be a nurse and a mother and a person whose history didn't precede her into every room. "All right," she said. "What do we do, Mike?" What they did was not complicated, but it required moving quickly on 3 simultaneous tracks. And Rachel understood each one clearly enough to know where her part was and where to stay out of the way. Track 1 was legal, and it was Reyes and Keating's. NCIS would formally take the unauthorized access case. JAG would handle the disclosure violation. Soto's supervisor had already suspended his system access pending investigation, which meant the machine had started grinding the moment the sequence was visible. That track would take months, federal proceedings always did, but it had started, and it had started correctly, and Rachel did not need to be in it to know it would run to its conclusion. Track 2 was institutional, and it was Voss's. The base commander issued a formal public statement at 17:15 that afternoon, posted to the installation's official channels, and distributed to the journalists Soto had tagged before they could construct their own framing from his post. The statement was 2 paragraphs. The first described the unauthorized access and disclosure as a federal violation under investigation. The second described Rachel Carter's voluntary disclosure, made at 14:41, 3 minutes after Soto's post, and her service record in full, including the Navy Cross, including Ramadi, including the names of the Marines she had treated, who had been contacted and had given written consent to be named. Marcus Reyes was one of them. He sent the consent form from Albuquerque in 11 minutes, which Reyes told Rachel about in a voice that was doing the same controlled but barely thing it had been doing all afternoon. "He said to tell you," Reyes said, "that he's been waiting for someone to say your name out loud for 17 years. He said he's glad it's finally yours to say." Rachel looked at the wall. "Tell him thank you," she said. Track 3 was Rachel's, and it was the smallest and the hardest. She called the number the video had been posted to, the Veterans Community Group where it had started, before the public share, before the journalists, before all of it. The administrator of the group picked up on the 3rd ring, and she told him who she was, and she said, "The woman in that video is me. I'd like to make a statement to your community directly, if you'll let me." He was quiet for long enough that she thought the call had dropped. Then he said in a voice that was not composed, "Yes, ma'am, I'll post whatever you want." She dictated it in 3 sentences. She didn't perform it. She didn't write toward the emotional response she knew it would produce. She just said the true thing, cleanly, without decoration. The woman in the video is Rachel Carter. She was at Iron Ridge to watch her son graduate from the same Marine Corps she served in for 7 years. What happened to her this morning was wrong. What she did 19 years ago and what was done to her record today is now a matter of federal record. She is fine. Her son is a Marine. The rest belongs to the investigators. It was posted within the hour. The comments section, which had been running on righteous fury since the morning, went somewhere different, quieter. The particular quiet of people who had been angry on behalf of someone and were now, having met her, adjusting their relationship with the situation from outrage to something more considered. Not everyone. Some of them got louder. But the tenor changed, and that was enough. But the family dinner for Delta Company began at 1800 on the outdoor terrace adjacent to the mess hall, with round tables and the particular awkward warmth of new Marines trying to be simultaneously formal and relaxed in the presence of their families for the first time in 3 months. Rachel arrived at 1807, which was late enough to be intentional and early enough not to be rude. She was still in the floral blouse and khaki slacks from the morning, because she had not packed an alternate outfit for a day she had expected to spend entirely in folding chairs in a parking lot. Colonel Voss was there, which was not standard. Commanding officers did not typically attend Delta Company family dinners, and her presence created a small gravitational shift in the room that people felt without being able to entirely explain. She was standing near the edge of the terrace when Rachel arrived, and she crossed to her without pretense. "How are you?" Voss said. "I've had longer days," Rachel said. Voss looked at her for a moment. "You know the video had over 60,000 views by 1700. "I know." "And Soto's post was taken down at 1652. Platform complied with the federal flag faster than usual." "I know that too." Voss was quiet. Then, "He's going to argue he acted in the public interest. His counsel will build around that." "His counsel will build around whatever he pays them to build around," Rachel said. That's their job. The sequence of events is documented, and it doesn't change. She looked at the terrace, the families, the young Marines, the particular quality of light that outdoor gatherings in the desert had in the early evening, warm and slightly unreal. What happens to him isn't something I can control. What I can control is already in the record. Voss nodded slowly. For what it's worth, the findings on Mercer came back this afternoon. Formal reprimand, suspension of leadership responsibilities pending mandatory remedial review. The unauthorized credential use is being handled separately by personnel security. She paused. He's not going to be what he was planning to be. Not for a while. Maybe not at all. Rachel thought about Mercer, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the specific absence of feeling that came when you'd already settled your relationship to something and didn't need to revisit it. He had been a man who treated people as problems. He had been corrected. That was as much as she needed from that story. What he did in that corridor was wrong, she said. The review said so, and the public record says so, and that's what matters. She paused. What he does with the next 10 years of his life, that's up to him. Voss looked at her with something that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. Most people would want more than that, she said. Most people haven't spent 19 years deciding what they actually need, Rachel said. Tut. Jonah found her at one of the outer tables, slightly removed from the main group, which was exactly where she would have sat, and which told her again that he was made of more of her material than either of them had previously had cause to measure. He sat across from her. He had a plate with food on it that he wasn't eating yet, and he looked like the day had happened to him the way days like this happen to people, thoroughly, without leaving any part untouched. The guys in my unit know, he said, about the Navy Cross. I figured. He paused, hunting for the right word with the precision she'd bred into him. Overwhelmed. They should focus on graduating, she said. He almost smiled. That's what I told them. They were quiet for a moment in the particular comfortable way that was its own kind of conversation. Are you going to be okay? He said. The real answer. Rachel looked at the desert going dark at its edges beyond the installation fence. The mountains she'd looked at this morning from the restricted path, brown and red and worn down by centuries, were going purple now in the last of the light, the way desert mountains did, that transition so abrupt it always looked painted. The record's mine now, she said. It went out wrong, but it went out, and what it says is true, and I said it. She looked at him. That's better than where I was this morning. That's not really an answer. No, she agreed, but it's what I have right now. He looked at her, that long, careful 19-year-old reading of her face that she'd been subject to for years and had never entirely gotten used to. You stayed in that building, he said, in Ramadi, when they told you to get out. Yes. Why? She had been asked this before, by the commendation board, in the formal language of official assessment, by herself, in the informal language of the years that followed. She had given different answers at different times, depending on what was true in that particular moment. Tonight, to her son, in his new uniform, on his first day as a Marine, she gave the one that had always been truest. Because the man on the floor was still bleeding, she said. And I was the person in the room who knew how to stop it. That's the whole answer, she paused. It was never more complicated than that. People want it to be more complicated because simple answers make them uncomfortable. But the only thing I thought about in that building was the bleeding and what I needed to do about it, and how much time I had. She looked at him. Everything else, the medal, the story, today, all of that happened afterward. That's not why I stayed. I stayed because it was what I could do. Jonas sat with that, he was quiet long enough that the dinner around them had moved into its middle phase, conversations layering over each other, someone laughing at a distant table. The dessert being brought out by two mess hall Marines who looked barely older than the recruits they were serving. I want to be that, he said finally, not to impress her, not to compare. Just a statement of direction from someone who had just found at 19 a very specific thing to aim toward. Rachel looked at her son. Then do your job well, she said. Every time, even when no one's watching, especially when no one's watching. She paused. That's the only way I know to become it. He nodded. It was the kind of nod that was a commitment, not just an acknowledgement. They ate dinner. The conversation moved to other things, normal things. The 3-month gap, his plans, her hospital, whether she was going to stay an extra night in Tucson or drive back. The mundane infrastructure of a family relationship that had been stretched across a significant day and was now contracting back toward ordinary size. It was, Rachel thought, one of the better dinners she could remember. Not because it was easy or because the day had been anything other than what it was, but because the person sitting across from her was no longer the edited version of the story she'd been telling him for 19 years. He was in the real one now, with the weight of the actual truth, and he was still there, still across the table, still her son, in his new uniform, eating institutional dessert in the Arizona evening. That was not nothing. That was, if she was being precise about it, almost everything. Gerald Soto was placed on administrative leave the following morning, pending federal investigation. The NCIS case was formally opened within 48 hours, with Reyes as lead investigator. His counsel did, as Voss had predicted, attempt to construct a public interest defense. It did not hold. The sequence, Annex Access at 0917, motion filed at 1100, authorization code generated at 1243, was documented in 3 separate systems and was not subject to interpretation. He had taken the record before he had the right to take it, and he had published it knowing that, and the law on both points was not ambiguous. The proceedings ran 8 months. At the end of them, Gerald Soto was convicted on 2 federal counts, fined, and stripped of his federal clearance. He would not work in a records office again. Dale Mercer completed the mandatory remedial program assigned by his review board. He lost his leadership position. He retained his commission, though in a diminished capacity. He sent Rachel a second letter 6 months after the first, longer this time, less formal, less managed. It described what he'd thought about during the review process and what he was trying to do differently. She read it once. She didn't respond, but she didn't discard it. She put it in a drawer, the way you put things you haven't finished having a relationship with. Walt Pryor retired from the Marine Corps the following spring. At his retirement ceremony, he named 3 people who had shaped his understanding of service. Rachel Carter was one of them. She found out through Reyes, who had attended and sent her a photograph. Pryor in his dress uniform, looking at the camera with the specific expression of a man who had said something true in public and was inhabiting the strange freedom of that. She called him. They talked for 40 minutes, the way people talked when they'd been orbiting the same event for years, and finally had the time to look at it from all angles. He told her about Okafor in San Diego. She told him about Jonah. He said, near the end, that he thought about the restricted path sometimes, about what would have happened if he hadn't been there, if he hadn't recognized the tattoo, if the morning had gone differently. Don't, she said. I know, he said, but I do anyway. Me too, she admitted. That was the most honest thing she'd said about the day in months, and it felt right to say it to him. Jonah deployed for the first time 14 months after graduation. He called her the night before from wherever he was, which she was not permitted to know precisely, and they talked for 22 minutes about nothing important, a deliberate choice on both their parts, the comfortable noise of ordinary life laid over the fact of what tomorrow was. Before he hung up, he said, "The man on the floor." She knew immediately what he meant. "Yes," she said. "I'm going to remember that," he said, "every time." She held the phone after the call ended and sat in the kitchen of her Flagstaff apartment with the late-night quiet around her, the refrigerator's hum, the distant sound of a car on the street below, the specific quality of nighttime silence in a high-desert city that she had come to know so completely over 17 years that it was indistinguishable from her own internal landscape. She was a Navy Cross recipient who had spent 17 years being a nurse and a mother, and a woman who took wrong turns on base paths and stood still when authority pushed her because she knew, from long experience, that the best response to being underestimated was to simply remain what you actually were and let the world catch up. The world had caught up. Badly, loudly, on a July Tuesday, in front of hundreds of strangers and a digital camera and her son's graduation ceremony. It had caught up through a federal case and a formal record and a post on a veterans community page that had been shared 11,000 times and had generated, among other things, a letter from a woman in Memphis she'd never met who said she was a veteran's widow and that reading about Rachel's day had made her feel, for the first time in 3 years, like somebody in an official capacity understood what military service actually cost people who didn't wear the cost visibly. Rachel had written back. That had surprised her. She was not by nature a correspondent, but she'd written back. And then the woman had written again, and then a third time. And somewhere in the fourth exchange, Rachel had understood that this was also something she could do. Not with a credential or a rank or a record, just with the fact of having been in the room and having stayed and having come out of it still functional enough to talk about it honestly. She thought about what Farr had said. Not patience, a specific kind of strength. She'd carried that sentence the way she carried several things, acknowledged, set in its proper weight. The strength she'd had in that building in Ramadi was not different in its fundamental nature from the strength she'd needed to stand still on that restricted path while a captain made a public production of questioning her right to be there. It was the same thing, the same capacity. The deployment was different, the stakes were different, the context was different, the physical cost was different, but the core of it was identical. Know what you are, stay in it, do the thing in front of you, let the rest catch up when it does. It always does. That was the thing she wished someone had told her when she was 19. The thing she would have said to that girl if the architecture of time bent that way. They will underestimate you, sometimes to your face, sometimes behind a desk, sometimes in a corridor with your son's graduation program in your hand. They will see what you look like and decide what you are, and they will be wrong, and they will be very confident about being wrong. And none of that will change what you actually are. Nothing they do changes that. The only thing that changes it is you, choosing to stay what you are or choosing not to. So stay. Do the work. In the quiet rooms and the loud ones. When the recognition comes, accept it with the knowledge that it is accurate. When it doesn't come, go home and be a mother and a nurse and a person whose history belongs to her. And when someone grabs your arm on a restricted path and tells you to leave, stand still. Because the gunnery sergeants of the world are always closer than you think.